Excellent. So today I want to talk to you about something a little bit different. Uh, Largely when we have conversations about race and gender, we focus on politics, we focus on our sensibilities of how we think we should act towards people, and we focus on what we take to be an obvious and intuitive visibility of how patriarchy, gender works, specifically the oppression of women. What I'd like to do today is move beyond a conversation of politics to understand and diagnose how white supremacist patriarchal societies actually operate towards groups of racialized men excluded from that society. We've made general assumptions, largely coming out of the birth of second wave feminism in the 1960s and 70s, about how gender operates. The field that I started, Black Male Studies, takes a social, scientific, and conceptual view of how patriarchies around the world actually operate. And what we find when we empirically investigate genocides, imperial conquests, ethnic conflict, racist regimes, is that patriarchies seek to exterminate subordinate and racialized men, first in genocides and then throughout the rest of the repressive regime. Now, despite this obvious and historical fact that we could trace all the way back to antiquity, there's very little conversation about how subordinate and racialized men are actually oppressed by patriarchal, white supremacist, and racist societies. So we try to remedy that in the study of black men and their vulnerability. Now, when I was in the United States, I gave a lecture for black academics. And black academics is like the black TED Talk. All right. And I said I challenged the audience to think about this seriously. That while we'll disown the racist caricatures of black men and boys as super predators, we simultaneously imagine them as voids, vacuous figures that we're fine not knowing. We don't care about how they suffer during their lives, but love performing outrage at their deaths. So black men and boys in the United States have been shown to the world largely as victims of police violence. The popularity of BLM in the UK, the protest for racial justice, uses the black male body as a symbol. But the corpse signals something to the world. It's dead flesh. It represents nothing but the interpretation that the world seeks to impose upon it, which is why many of the conversations surrounding the death of young black men and boys in the United States revolves around the demonization of their lives. We all know Emmett Till. Emmett Till became a symbol of civil rights. But I want you to pay attention to something. Don't focus on the grotesque nature of what happened to this young man. Ask yourself a more fundamental question. What does it show us? What does it demonstrate to us? The mutilated black male body. We're disgusted by the fact that something like this could happen to a human being. But I ask you to think about the fact that young black boys in the United States have never been seen as human beings. And I don't mean that rhetorically. I don't mean to create the impulse that, oh, we must reach towards humanity. I'm asking you to conceptualize more seriously the fact that in contemporary Western democracies, we have groups of populations that are not seen as human or are treated as such. And if we take that as a starting point of how we analyze questions of racism, and particularly the racialized male situation, can we be surprised that this is the outcome? Does this not seem like the inevitability of people who live in our contemporary societies but are still dehumanized? This is something that ran in National Geographic a few years ago. It was celebrated because it was trying to show the suffering that mothers had to the death of young black men and boys. Now, to most people, this would seem unproblematic. But I ask you this question. What living being is presented to the world as a corpse? What is it in the imagery of black men as quantitative numbers, statistics, that are no longer alive, that so motivates the world to pay attention? But notice in this image, it's not the black boy that's the focus of this editorial. It's the black mother. So like Emmett Till, where the black mother decided to show the world the horror, the empathy that we have for the situation goes to the mother and not to the void that is the black male. Can we empathize or sympathize for black men and boys? And if we can't, What is it that makes that quality so palatable? So what I want to do is start with some very basic social scientific facts about black men and boys that I really think drives this point home. So for those of you who don't know, in the United States, black males have the lowest life expectancy of any group. Now, after COVID, that life expectancy decreased another 3 years. So roughly black men live between 67 and 70 years compared to the rest of the population. Now, while people look at this and say, well, men generally die earlier, etc., what I ask you to look is the negative slope, the disparity. Why are we so comfortable with the absence of a certain demographic in a population? If we are indeed a democratic society, what is it about the black male population, the negative stereotypes, criminals, rapists, lower IQs than their female counterparts and whites, thieves? What is it that we're so comfortable accepting about this group such that it not only justifies their exclusion, but their outright absence, if not disappearance, from our social spaces? This is a curve showing the percentage of survival curve showing the percentage of black men or black males that reach the age of 20. Think about that, 20 years old. Someone who barely gets past their teenage years. See, back in the 1970s, two sociologists argued that the difference between American racism and the liberal conceptualization of racism as discrimination was that black males suffer from institutional decimation. Now, James Stewart and his co-authors suggested that if we look at how racism actually operates, moving from segregation to an integration to society, we don't get the promise of racial equality that we thought. In other words, desegregation did not eliminate both the state and social pressures to eliminate groups they thought were threats to white society. Now, while that's an unpopular view for people who think that civil rights and democracy have moved us to the promised land, to a truly civil and tolerant society, you have to ask yourselves, why is it that the exemptions we find in the society are so powerful and mimic what we've seen throughout history? Said differently, what is it about the spectacle of lynching, about the mutilation of black male bodies that seems so repetitive, that seems like such a persistent technology of racial oppression, that we could both recognize the deaths of young black men and boys in the United States as a terror and a lynching that mimics and imitates what we've seen throughout history, especially with that of Emmett Till? Now, a lot of focus has come on the killing of black people by police in the United States. I'll tell you, growing up in the United States, I'm from the South, I've had guns pulled on me more times than not. Well, the first times actually was when I was in grad school at DePaul University. I actually had a pea coat on in the middle of the winter with a chest bag around my chest going to the chess club. Two cops came up to my window pointing guns at me, and one was behind me, right, like on his edge of the window with his gun pointed to me. So 3 guns pointed at me, all right? And I remember I didn't tell my mom at the time. She would have made me come home. But it tells you something. My heartbeat didn't even jump, because I knew that if it did, it would be an excuse for them to shoot me dead right there. Now imagine that. Don't imagine that as a racial situation, a horrible racial circumstance. Imagine that as the condition that black boys are trained to deal with from birth. Imagine being in a society so hostile to you that your death doesn't even flicker in terms of the societal norms that you have. So when we talk about gender, when we talk about patriarchal oppression, hell, when we talk about racism, it's not to intimate an idea of unfairness. Rather, it's talking about actual processes that overwhelmingly European countries have used to experiment with various strategies of death and dying against a marginalized racial population. So if we start thinking about racism as a process that brings about death, then it's not surprising to see why black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police, and black women are about 1.4 times more likely to be killed by police than white women. And while people have tried to play this out in the media as a kind of gender war, I urge you just to look at the facts. That means that 96 per 100,000 black men will be killed, compared to 5.4 per 100,000 their female counterpart. Think about that disparity. So then what does it mean to suggest being male in patriarchal white societies our privilege, our power, your life chances are almost cut in half. But we don't have an analysis to think about the ways that oppression is systemically intertwined with the desire that white societies have to be rid of these groups of people. And that's why I asked and urged you, when you start thinking about the ways that white societies regulate themselves, deal with undesirables, choose not to let certain migrant populations into the country, then you're dealing with the deliberate strategy engineered by the state and the population to make sure not only that the population looks a certain way, but that it has the proper and legitimate democratic means to exterminate and eliminate populations that it sees fit. And that's what's interesting about the vulnerability of black men and boys. The disparities that you see in terms of lifetime risks means that black men and boys live in a situation of surveillance. And I want to stress this point. That means that within a democratic society that we claim is evolved and free, a civil society that is supposed to be based on recognition and dialogue, we have absolutely no problem accepting that genocidal mechanisms and techniques are being used towards a certain population. So that means that there is not an incompatibility between surveillance, death, and other strategies of dying that we take to be incompatible with a free society. Studying black men and boys points out this contradiction. It is not an urge for us to incorporate them into some system of recognition that it tugs at the heartstrings of the white population. Rather, in studying the vulnerability of black men and boys, we understand that it points out the contradiction of our systemic and conceptual analysis. That democracy not only thrives instead of fails with the murder of certain people, but is accepted as a norm and better for the society. People have become enriched. Darren Wilson almost became a millionaire when he killed a young boy in Missouri. You have white people contributing to the Justice Fund and the enrichment of white people, largely white men who are killing black men and boys in my country. So where's the outrage? Where's the disgust? Is it simply in the political movements that happen to make it across the ocean? But then you ask yourself the question, despite the celebration and recognition of Black Lives Matter, has the deaths of black men decreased? And the answer is no. So in Ashley Plant, Jopelin, and Kutzman's study, they actually wanted to understand the trigger that black maleness had in the minds of whites. So utilizing college-educated white students, what they showed was that white participants showed a pronounced bias towards shooting black men, but a bias away from shooting black women and white in-group members. Participants in their study were biased away from shooting the female suspects, even when the female suspects were armed. Specifically, when responding to black and white women, participants tended to make more mistakes of not shooting armed suspects than mistakenly shooting unarmed suspects. So that's what this looks like. Look at the error in shooting unarmed black men. And this is what I mean. This is real time. A bunch of college-educated white people were more likely to shoot an unarmed black man than armed white men, armed white women, armed black women.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.